For 15 years straight, my family sent out hundreds of perfect Christmas cards. Yet I was never in a single photo. Then one day, they suddenly invited me back into the frame as if nothing had ever happened. But after standing outside the photo studio door for just a few minutes that day, I heard something that made me turn around and walk away for good. My name is Serena Carter. I'm 34 years old. And there is one truth. It took me a very long time to finally name for what it was. My family erased me from the picture for 15 years. Every Christmas season, my family would send out hundreds of cards to neighbors, friends, coworkers, and people from church. Every single one was polished, perfect, and complete. The Carter family, smiling brightly in matching outfits against a warm, festive backdrop. The only thing was, I was never in any of them. Not once by accident. Not one year because they forgot. But for 15 years in a row, I was left out as if I had never existed. At first, I tried to comfort myself by thinking it must have been a coincidence. That maybe next year they would finally call me in. But as one year passed into the next, I slowly realized that my absence was not an accident. It was a choice. A choice repeated so many times that it became a message I did not belong in the family portrait they wanted the world to see. The most painful part was not just being left out of the photo. The most painful part was seeing those cards everywhere, watching other people hang them over their fireplaces, pin them to office boards, or stick them on their refrigerators while I knew exactly what was hidden behind those smiles, the cold, deliberate erasure of their own daughter. I used to think that if I were more obedient, more successful, more pleasant, then maybe one day they would save a place for me. But eventually I understood that the problem was never me. The problem was that they needed a perfect family portrait, and I did not fit the story they wanted to tell. The first time I was erased from the Christmas photo, I was 19. Back then, I was still naive enough to believe that every family had its confusing moments. But in the end, family was still family. That morning, my mother announced over breakfast that we were all going to Harrison's studio for our Christmas pictures. She said it so casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The whole family would go, dress nicely, and smile for the camera. I believed her. I even spent 2 full hours choosing a forest green sweater dress, carefully doing my makeup and hair, and telling myself that this time I would try to look especially pretty so my parents would be pleased. But the moment I stepped into the studio, I felt that something was wrong. The photographer looked up, frowned slightly, and said he thought only 3 people were scheduled for the session. My mother gave him the perfect smile she reserved for outsiders and replied that I was only there to watch. I froze. Before I could even process what was happening, my father took hold of my elbow and led me into the hallway. He spoke quietly, coldly, as if he were explaining something completely reasonable. I did not photograph well, standing next to the rest of the family. The studio lighting did not suit me, and Christmas cards had to be perfect. I sat in the lobby for 45 minutes. Through the glass, I watched them laugh, chat, and shift from pose to pose, calling to one another in the cheerful voices I never heard when it was only family at home. Megan tossed her hair and posed like a little princess, while my parents beamed with pride. At one point, I passed a mirror and caught sight of myself under the studio lights. I looked completely fine. No. To be honest, I looked beautiful. That was when I understood that the problem had never been the lighting. It had never been my face either. The problem was that they did not want me in the picture. After that day, I began to realize that being left out was not a one-time thing. It became an invisible rule in my family. Every holiday, every milestone, every moment that should have been preserved together, I was pushed to the edge of the story. At first, I tried to come up with kind explanations for them. Maybe my mother was too busy. Maybe my father simply did not notice. Maybe Megan was favored because she was younger. But the older I got, the less I could keep lying to myself. I came to see that my family did not truly consider me part of the image they wanted other people to see. They did not drive me away with daily shouting. And they never openly declared that they did not want me. What they did was even more painful. They treated me like an unnecessary detail. They kept me outside the frame and acted as though it were the most natural thing in the world. No arguments. No explanations. No apologies. They simply went on living as if my absence made no difference at all. There were years when I received a Christmas card sent by my own family, only to see my father, mother, and Megan standing close together in a composition so complete it felt cruel. There was no space for me anywhere in it. No sign that another daughter had ever existed in that family. They stood there like a perfect trio, while I had been reduced to something not even worth mentioning. I used to stare at those photos for a long time and ask myself, what did I do wrong? Why was I always the one left out? But the pain repeated itself so many times that it eventually turned into a bitter kind of understanding. I was not forgotten. I was deliberately erased. Some people think hurt only comes from direct insults. It does not. Sometimes the deepest wound is being excluded from every piece of evidence that you ever belonged there at all. 3 years later, I graduated magna cum laude with a degree in accounting. It was not just a diploma to me. It was the result of countless sleepless nights, 2 part-time jobs, and all the times I had to calculate every dollar just to buy textbooks because my parents said they could not afford to help me. Meanwhile, Megan was living a much lighter life, even being rewarded with a trip to Cancun for finishing her first year of college. I was not jealous that my sister received gifts. What hurt was that? In my parents' eyes, that difference was never considered unfair. On graduation day, I walked across the stage with my head held high. I was truly proud of myself. I thought that no matter what, at least that day my family might finally see me differently. But when the ceremony ended and I found them in the crowd, my mother was fixing Megan's dress while my father already had his phone out, ready to take pictures. My mother cheerfully said that they had to hurry and take some photos while the light was still good. But the person they carefully positioned in front of the fountain, the one they photographed from angle after angle, was Megan, my 19-year-old sister, who was not even graduating that day. I stood there holding my diploma, watching them take the 47th photo of my sister. I remember that number clearly because I counted. I kept hoping that once they were done with Megan, they would finally turn to me. I lifted my diploma slightly and asked in a small voice, "Could someone take one picture of me?" My mother said they would do it in a minute. But that in a minute never came. That night, I went home and saw that a new 8x10 framed photo was already hanging on the living room wall, Megan, smiling brightly beside the fountain. My diploma. Meanwhile, I was still sitting on the kitchen counter exactly where I had left it. No one had touched it. No one had taken a single picture of me. In the end, the only photo I had from my own graduation day was one taken by a kind stranger. By the time I turned 28, I had built a life with my own 2 hands. I became a senior accountant at Morrison & Wells, rented a small apartment with exposed brick walls, decorated every corner exactly the way I wanted. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a place that belonged to me. It was not my childhood home. And it was not a place where my parents were waiting for me at the dinner table. But it was the first space where I could breathe without needing anyone's permission. I also met Marcus at a photography exhibit. He had gentle eyes, paint-stained hands, and a smile that made me feel like I did not have to brace myself just to be accepted. After we had been seeing each other for a while, Marcus asked me one evening if he could see my family photos. It was a simple, gentle question, but it left me silent for a long time. In the end, I had to tell him the truth I had avoided for years in my family. I was the one who was never allowed to appear in the pictures. Marcus did not pressure me to explain. And he did not look at me with pity. He simply took my hand. That gentleness hurt me even more. Because it showed me what a normal, loving response should have looked like all along. That night, lying in bed, I realized something every time I stayed silent. Every time I accepted being erased. I was helping them make that invisibility permanent. I was not just being excluded from photographs. I was being erased from the history of my own family. If I kept staying quiet, one day I would be remembered as the daughter who had never existed. If you were in my position, how long would you endure it? Comment 1 if you believe no one should be treated like a shadow by their own family. For me, that was the first time I understood that this was no longer just about a few photographs. It was about the right to exist in the story of my own life. Marcus was the first person who made me see my family from a completely different angle. One day, while we were walking through the park with dry leaves rustling under our feet, he told me that he often photographed wealthy families, the kind of old, polished families who wanted every detail to look perfect. Then he said something I have never forgotten. The people who are most obsessed with looking flawless are often the ones hiding the ugliest truths behind the scenes. I stayed quiet for a long time after hearing that. I thought about those glossy Christmas cards, the carefully coordinated outfits, the matching smiles that looked as if they had been practiced in front of a mirror. All of it had been staged to tell one story: the Carter family was happy, close, elegant, and spotless. But if they were truly happy, why did they need to erase me? If they truly loved one another, why did they have to perform it? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe I had never been the problem that needed fixing. I was simply living proof that the family was not as perfect as they wanted everyone to believe. That was when I started thinking more and more about my grandmother Eleanor. She was my mother's mother. Living alone in a brown house, about 3 hours outside the city. When I was little, she always sent me birthday gifts and Christmas presents, wrote me careful handwritten cards, and called to talk with me about books, birds, and her garden. When I was with her, I never felt like I had to fight for a place just to be seen. Then, around the time I turned 20, all of her calls started going to voicemail, and the letters I sent were never answered. My mother said Grandma was tired, that she needed space, and that I should not bother her. I believed that for a long time. I told myself that one more person not wanting to stay in touch with me was nothing unusual. But deep down, it still hurt. Because if even my grandmother, the one rare person who had made me feel loved, had also drifted away from me, then maybe I really was someone too difficult for anyone to hold on to. The truth about my grandmother came to me by chance through Aunt Ruth, my mother's younger sister. She was the kind of woman who had spent her whole life being quiet and kind, always overshadowed at every family gathering. That day, I ran into her at the farmer's market, and one sentence from her turned my whole world upside down. She said Grandma Eleanor had always been asking about me. I nearly dropped my coffee. I thought I had heard her wrong. In my mind, my grandmother was the one who had chosen to cut me off years ago. But Ruth looked at me for a long moment and said that my mother had been blocking letters and phone calls for years. Grandma thought I was too busy. And eventually she came to believe I no longer wanted to see her. Meanwhile, I had been convinced that she no longer wanted me in her life. With a single sentence, Aunt Ruth pulled back the curtain and revealed a truth that left me breathless. The relationship between my grandmother and me had been deliberately destroyed. Not by misunderstanding, not by time, but by my mother. What I felt in that moment is hard to describe. It was not just heartbreak. It felt like discovering that someone had been quietly stealing from my life for years, then forcing me to live with the pain of feeling abandoned. A chill ran through me when I thought about my grandmother still waiting for my letters, still wondering what she had done wrong for her granddaughter to suddenly fall silent. And I thought about myself too, about all those years I had swallowed the feeling of being turned away by my own family. Aunt Ruth also told me that Grandma Eleanor used to say I reminded her of herself when she was young. Someone who was also treated like an outsider in her own family. I do not know why that hurt even more. But it did. Maybe because deep down, I knew there was a bond between us. And my mother had used her own hands to cut it apart. This November, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening. It was my mother. I almost did not answer. Her voice sounded strange that night. Softer than usual. As if she were trying to wrap herself in a gentleness that did not belong to her. She said the family would be taking Christmas photos at Harrison's studio that Sunday. And they wanted me there. I sat frozen after hearing those words. 15 years of being shut out. And now suddenly I was invited back. As if that empty space had never existed. I asked her directly why. She hesitated for a moment. Then mentioned Grandma Eleanor. She said Grandma was unwell and wanted to see the whole family reunited. The moment she said that, I felt something was wrong. My mother was not the kind of person who suddenly softened out of love for family. If she had truly wanted me back out of affection, that would have happened years ago, not only now. When my grandmother might not have much time left. The change was too sudden. And every warning bell in my head went off at once. I called Marcus and told him everything. He did not say my mother was definitely planning something. But he told me that people do not change that quickly without a reason. That was what made me decide not to refuse right away. Part of me wanted to turn my back and walk away. But another part of me needed the truth. If they suddenly needed me, I wanted to know why. And if it had anything to do with Grandma Eleanor, I could not pretend not to care. The next morning, I called Aunt Ruth. I did not waste time. I asked her what was really happening with Grandma and why my family suddenly wanted me in the photo. Ruth let out a heavy sigh. Within just a few minutes, I learned that this photo session was not an invitation to reunite. It was a carefully staged performance. And I was the last missing prop. Aunt Ruth told me that Grandma Eleanor had been in hospice for 2 months. She was reviewing everything, including her assets and her will. The moment I heard that, it felt like my heart dropped straight to the floor. I had barely begun to process the pain of knowing she was in the final stage of her life when Ruth continued. Grandma had started asking why I never appeared in family photos, why I never came to visit, and why I never answered her letters. And my mother had lied. She told Grandma that I was the one who had chosen to distance myself, that I was busy, withdrawn, and no longer wanted anything to do with the family, that I did not like having my picture taken and did not want to be included. Every word felt like claws scraping across my chest. My mother had not only erased me from the photographs, she had rewritten the entire story to turn me into the cold granddaughter. The distant daughter. The one who walked away by choice. Ruth said, Grandma Eleanor's estate was worth around $4 million. And she had originally intended to divide it equally among her children and grandchildren. But lately, she had begun to suspect that something was wrong. So my mother promised that this year there would be one complete family photo. Everyone together. To prove that the family was still close. At that point, every piece fell into place. They were not inviting me back because they cared about me. They were inviting me because they needed evidence. They needed me to stand in the right spot, smile at the right moment, and help deceive a dying woman into believing that this family had always been whole. I was so furious that my voice became strangely calm. Maybe when anger grows too large, it turns cold. I told Aunt Ruth that, this time, they were not going to get what they wanted so easily. That night, I pulled a cardboard box out from under my bed. Inside were 15 years of my family's Christmas cards. Something I had quietly collected from neighbors. My father's co-workers. My mother's book club friends. Anyone willing to give me a copy. I had never fully known why I kept them, but in that moment, I understood I had been preserving evidence for this day. Marcus and I sat at the kitchen table and spread all the Christmas cards out in front of us. Every year looked terrifyingly the same, my father. My mother. Megan. Perfect smiles. Warm holiday wishes, and no trace of me. I told Marcus everything Aunt Ruth had just revealed the hospice. The will. The fact that they now needed me as a fake missing piece to convince Grandma that the family was still united. Marcus was silent for a few seconds, then looked at the pile of cards as if he were staring at the printed history of a betrayal. We decided to make an album. Each year would have its own page. On the left would be the official Carter family Christmas card, the one where I did not exist. On the right would be a photo of me from that same year, me in my dorm room. Me on graduation day. Me at my first job. Me in my tiny apartment. Me living a real life, while they sent out a fake version of our family to the world. We also left space for Grandma Eleanor's letters, which Aunt Ruth said she would let me see before the photo shoot. By then, I no longer saw this as an impulsive act. It was a record of the systematic erasure they had carried out against me for 15 years. That was the moment I knew I was going to say yes to the photo session. Not to forgive them. Not to play the role of the good daughter finally welcomed back into the family. I was going because I needed to hear them say, in their own words, what they truly thought. I wanted the evidence to exist not only in those old Christmas cards, but also in what came out of their mouths. And if you are still following my story at this point, I like this video if you believe the truth, but it is still worth exposing. Because sometimes a single click of support is more than that. It is a way of saying that no one deserves to be used like a decoration in their own family. 2 days before the photo shoot, Aunt Ruth asked to meet me at our usual coffee shop. She brought a large envelope, thick and heavy, and placed it on the table in front of me with both hands, as if it contained not papers, but something sharp enough to wound. She said she should have given it to me years ago. I opened the envelope and found dozens of letters, all addressed to me in Grandma Eleanor's familiar, delicate handwriting. My hands started shaking the moment I saw them. I opened the first letter. It was written in December 2009. Grandma asked whether I had received the blue sweater she had sent, and said that my mother told her I was busy with school and had not had time to call back yet, but that I should call whenever I could because she missed hearing my voice. Then I opened another letter. And another. Birthdays. Christmases. Questions about my studies. My job. My hopes for the future. And whether she had done something to make me upset with her. The more I read, the blurrier my vision became with tears. For 15 years. She had kept writing. She had kept waiting. She had never understood why I had gone silent. And all that time, I had been living with the belief that she no longer wanted me. In that moment, I was not crying only because of the pain. I was crying for everything that had been stolen from both of us. The conversations we never had. The visits we never shared. The years I should have spent sitting in her book-filled brownstone, listening to her stories. My mother had blocked all of it. The letters Grandma sent to me were hidden. The letters I sent to her likely never reached her either. Aunt Ruth said my mother did it to control the image, to make sure Grandma Eleanor saw only the version of the family she wanted to stage. I held the stack of letters tightly against my chest and understood that the album Marcus and I were making was not just proof that I had been erased from the photos, it was also proof that a relationship had been deliberately destroyed. And Grandma Eleanor, more than anyone, deserved to know that truth before it was too late. On Saturday night, Marcus and I sat at the dining table until nearly midnight, finishing the album. We worked on each page with great care, almost reverently, because I knew this was not just something to be sent away. It was testimony to the years both my grandmother and I had been deceived. On every page, the left side held the Carter family's Christmas card from that year, 3 people standing close together, smiling with that carefully polished perfection, with no trace that the family had ever had another daughter. On the right side was a photo of me from that same year at 19 in my dorm room. At 22, holding my diploma alone. At 25, standing beside my first desk at work. At 28, in my small, sunlit apartment, Marcus asked me why I had kept those cards all those years. I thought about it for a long time before answering. Maybe I kept them out of instinct. Maybe some hidden part of me had always known that one day I would need to prove that I had existed all along, only to be deliberately erased from my family's official record. We also added copies of Grandma Eleanor's letters to the album, her loving words, her waiting, and the heartbreaking lines asking if she had done something to upset me and cause my silence. On the first page, I placed a letter written by me. I told her that for 15 years I had believed she had forgotten me, that I thought she no longer wanted to hear from me. But I had been wrong. I wrote that I was sending her all of this not to hurt anyone, but because she deserved to know what had happened. Marcus closed the album very gently. He said this was not revenge. I shook my head. He was right. This was not revenge. It was the final way for my grandmother and me to truly see each other through the truth. On Sunday morning, I put on the red dress my mother had instructed me to wear, did my makeup carefully, and stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I looked fine, more than fine. Actually, I looked far better than the 19-year-old girl who had once sat outside that studio hallway, wondering what she had done wrong. This time, I was not going there to be chosen. I was going as someone who knew her own worth and knew very well that they needed me more than I needed them. Marcus drove me close to Harrison's studio and stopped a short distance away. He told me he would be waiting outside, and that all I had to do was send one text and he would be there immediately. That simple promise warmed me more than I expected. Someone was waiting for me outside, not to force me back into a place that had hurt me, but to make sure I would not have to face it alone. I got out of the car, took a few deep breaths, and walked toward the studio, arriving half an hour early just as I had planned. The front door was locked, but I remembered from childhood that the place had a side entrance for long-time clients. I slipped in quietly. The lobby was completely empty. Soft Christmas music drifted down from somewhere in the ceiling, making the whole scene feel even more strangely artificial. Through the glass partition, I could see the red backdrop, fake snow, and props already set in place. Voices were coming from the client waiting room. I pressed myself against the wall beside the half-closed door, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I had never imagined that my life would come to this, that I would one day be standing outside a door, listening in on my own family just to learn the truth about where I stood in it. But I also knew that if I did not hear it with my own ears that day, some part of me would always keep doubting myself. Maybe I was exaggerating. Maybe they really had changed. Maybe I was so bitter that I was seeing everything in the worst possible light. I needed the truth, raw and unfiltered. And just a few seconds later, I heard exactly what I had come for. Megan's voice was the first one I heard. She sounded openly annoyed as she asked whether I was really coming. My mother answered that I had confirmed the day before and would arrive at 2 o'clock. Then Megan let out a sigh and said she could not believe they had to put me in the photo this year after 15 years of everything being perfect without me. I stood frozen outside the door. Just those first few sentences were enough to destroy the last tiny piece of hope I still had. My mother replied that it was only one photo session, only 1 hour of pretending to be a happy family, and then everything would go back to normal. Her words cut so deeply that I had to cover my mouth to keep from making a sound. But the conversation did not stop there. My father spoke next, in the calm, practical tone of someone discussing a business deal. He repeated the number $4 million and said plainly that all they needed was for me to stand in the frame and smile so Eleanor would feel reassured enough to sign the papers. Megan asked what would happen after that. My father said I would go back to wherever I had been living, and they would not need to see me again until the next time they had a use for me. Then my mother laughed. It was a small laugh, but so sharp and cold that I will never forget it. She said I had always been a prop. I just had never known it before. In that moment, something inside me broke completely. Not because I was surprised deep down. I had already guessed part of the truth. But because of how casually they said it. To them, I was not a daughter. Not a sister. Not even a person. I was an empty space they could add or erase whenever it served their purpose. I also heard my mother say that she had already prepared this year's card design, leaving a blank space where I could be inserted. One click, and I could be added in. Another click, and I would be erased from their lives all over again. That was all I needed to hear. In that instant, I knew I had no reason left to stay silent. I pushed the door open and walked in. All three of them spun around. My mother was still holding the card mock-up in her hand. My father had gone stiff, and Megan stared at me with her mouth open as if she had seen a ghost. It was almost funny, because in this family, I had always been treated like one. My mother was the first to recover. She gave me that familiar smile, the kind that could fool strangers but had never fooled me. She said I had arrived earlier than expected. I told her I knew. And then I said plainly that I had heard everything. I repeated their own words back to them, prop. $4 million. After that, everything goes back to normal. The air in the room seemed to freeze. My father took a step toward me and tried to shift into an explanatory tone, telling me not to misunderstand. But for the first time in my life, I did not give him the chance to define my feelings for me. I asked him directly if they had truly always wanted me there. Why had my mother already prepared a card layout with an empty space, where I could simply be pasted in like a graphic element? No one had an answer. Megan had gone pale. My mother's voice began to change, turning from sugary to irritated, while my father tried to speak as if this were some kind of negotiation. But I was no longer there to ask for an apology or a fair argument. I had only needed the truth. And now I had it. I said I was done with all of it. I turned and walked toward the door. And my mother threw out the same threat she always used if I walked out that door. I should never come back again. I stopped for 1 second, turned to look at her, and said what I probably should have said years earlier. I had never truly been allowed in to begin with. Then I walked straight out into the cold December sunlight. Marcus was already waiting by the curb. He did not ask what I had heard. He just looked at my face and opened the car door. I got in and said, "Let's go. We still have a package to send." In that moment, I knew my life had turned in a different direction. From the studio, Marcus and I drove straight to Aunt Ruth's house. It was as if she had already guessed how things would end, because she was standing on the porch waiting for us. When she saw me carrying the album out of the car, she simply asked whether the photo session had not gone according to plan. I nodded. I did not need to explain the details, because some truths are so painful that one look is enough for someone to understand the damage they caused. I handed her the album and said I needed it to reach Grandma Eleanor without passing through my mother's hands. Ruth took the album with both hands, as if she were receiving something precious. She told me that she visited Grandma Eleanor in hospice every Tuesday and Thursday, and that she would bring it there herself. We sat together for a few more minutes to make one final check, the Christmas cards arranged in order by year, my photographs placed beside the matching milestones, copies of Grandma's letters, and the short explanatory notes. Everything in that album was dated, clear, and impossible to deny. There was no room left for the kind of twisted version of events my mother had been creating for years. As I watched Aunt Ruth's car drive away with the album on the back seat, I suddenly felt strangely empty. I had done my part. I had no control over what would happen next. Part of me hoped Grandma Eleanor would believe me immediately. Another part feared that the pain might be too much, and that she would choose the more comforting version my mother had given her instead. But deep down, I knew that no matter what happened, the truth had finally been given a chance to speak. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about my grandmother, about the letters she had written in loneliness, about the years she had spent hurting because she believed I had chosen to walk away. Somewhere 3 hours from me, she was about to turn the pages of that album and see everything that had been hidden for 15 years. And just thinking about that, I knew that from now on, nothing would ever go back to the way it was. 3 days later, Aunt Ruth called me that evening. The moment I heard her breathing, I knew Grandma Eleanor had seen the album. Ruth said she had cried for more than an hour. At first, my heart tightened. I was afraid I had caused her too much pain when her health was already so fragile. But Ruth stopped me from blaming myself. She said those were not tears of doubt. They were tears of anger, grief, and regret. Grandma kept repeating that they had stolen her granddaughter from her. When I heard that, my knees almost gave out. In a single moment, my deepest fear melted away. She believed me, not because I had spoken well, and not because Ruth had defended me, but because her own handwritten letters and 15 years of evidence had spoken for themselves. Ruth said that after Grandma finished looking through the album, she immediately called my mother. I do not know how that conversation went. I only know that right after, my mother called Ruth, screaming that I was destroying the family. But what left me truly speechless was Ruth's next sentence. Grandma Eleanor had called her lawyer and changed the paperwork. I quickly said that I had not done any of this for money. Ruth replied that Grandma understood that perfectly well, and that was exactly why she made her decision. According to Ruth, Grandma said I had not been trying to take anything from anyone. I had only been trying to be seen before it was too late. A dying woman understood that, while my parents had failed to see it for 15 years. Then Ruth told me that Grandma Eleanor wanted to see me alone before telling the rest of the family about her decision. The meeting was set for Thursday. I looked across the room at Marcus. He simply gave me a small nod, as if to say, "Go." That was when I finally understood something for the last 15 years. I had not only been waiting for acknowledgement, I had also been waiting to hear one sincere person say that they had never given up on me. And at last, that day had come. The hospice was quieter than I had imagined. The whole place felt soft and spotless, carrying a faint mix of flowers and antiseptic that made everything seem both gentle and heartbreakingly sad. When the nurse led me to room 14, I stood outside the door for a few seconds, trying to steady myself. Inside, Grandma Eleanor was sitting by the window in her wheelchair, the album open on her lap. The sight of that alone made my eyes sting. She looked up at me and held my gaze for a long moment, as if she were trying to memorize every line of my face. Then she said my name. Her voice was weak, but so warm that every defense inside me collapsed at once. I knelt beside her wheelchair, with trembling hands. She touched my face and said I had never abandoned her. I had been kept away from her. At that, I could not hold back my tears anymore. I admitted that I had spent all those years believing she no longer wanted to hear from me. She pulled me into her arms, and in that familiar scent of lavender and old paper, I felt as though the forgotten child inside me had finally been held again. We sat together for a long time. She told me the lawyer had come at 8 that morning for her to sign the new papers. She said this was not about money, but about the truth. Then she placed a small envelope in my hand and told me it contained letters she had written to each person: my mother, my father, Megan, and Ruth. She had explained clearly why she had changed everything and why she could no longer pretend not to know. I asked her what would happen when they read them. She gave a tired but unwavering smile and said that, in the end, they would have to understand that a family built on lies cannot stand, and that she had always known which granddaughter truly loved her. In that room, I did not think about the inheritance at all. I thought only about the fact that we had finally found our way back to each other before it was too late. We did not have 15 years to make up for, but at least we still had the truth. Megan's call came at 2 in the morning, like a storm crashing into the rare peace I had only just found again. I woke up to the sound of her screaming. She did not even bother with a greeting, she just demanded to know what I had done. I had to hold the phone away from my ear to catch the whole thing. She said Grandma Eleanor had sent letters to everyone. Dad was pacing around the living room like a madman, and Mom would not stop crying. I sat up in bed, calmer than I expected myself to be, and simply said that I had told Grandma the truth. Megan let out a shrill laugh and said I had destroyed the whole family. I asked her quietly, "What family? The family that had kept me out of photos for 15 years? The family that had blocked Grandma's letters to me? The family that had called on the other end of the line?" She went silent for a few seconds before breaking down into sobs. Then she admitted that Mom's share of the inheritance and hers had been cut drastically, while most of it had been transferred to me and Aunt Ruth. She said I had gotten what I wanted, but I told her that money had never been what I wanted. What I wanted was for Grandma to know that I had never abandoned her. The next morning, my father called. His voice was no longer angry, but had shifted into that familiar coldness he used whenever he wanted to negotiate. He told me I had made a serious mistake against the family. I replied that if the truth was enough to destroy the family, then maybe it had already been broken long before I ever spoke. He was even worse than Megan. He tried to minimize everything, dismissing 15 years of being erased from photos as just a few pictures. Then, at last, his real purpose came out. He said that if I spoke to Grandma Eleanor again and convinced her to change her mind, we could work something out and redistribute the inheritance. A chill ran through me as I listened. Even now, he still thought I could be bought. I told him he was still trying to use me like a bargaining chip. The only difference was that this time it was not for a photograph, but for money. When he threatened that if I hung up, then that would be the end of us, I said very softly, "We ended a long time ago. You just never noticed." Then I hung up. In the weeks that followed, everything changed completely. Aunt Ruth told me that my parents were in chaos, trying to contact Eleanor's lawyer to challenge the new arrangements. But it was useless because Grandma had been fully lucid when she signed the updated documents. In the end, my mother's and Megan's shares were reduced to only a small portion. My father received nothing because he was not a direct heir, and most of the estate was divided between Ruth and me. But to me, the most important thing was never the money. What mattered was that the wall of lies had finally come down. That Christmas, I was not in the old house, and I had no desire to watch my parents pretend to be a happy family anymore. I spent it with Marcus and Aunt Ruth, having a simple dinner, watching old movies, and enjoying a kind of peace I had never before believed I deserved. A few days later, we went to visit Grandma Eleanor. Ruth took out her phone and snapped a photo of us together, me kneeling beside Grandma's wheelchair, Marcus standing behind me with his hand on my shoulder, and Ruth smiling by the window. Grandma looked at the picture and said that this was what a real family looked like, not perfect, but honest. After she passed away on March 3, I inherited her brownstone and several boxes of old photographs. When I opened them, I found a family picture from 1965. In it, 16-year-old Eleanor stood slightly off to the edge of the frame, separated from the circle of her relatives. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Eleanor, the difficult child, always causing trouble." I sat there in silence for a long time. So she had once been pushed aside too. Just like me. And in that moment, I understood something. Deeply, pain in a family is often a cycle passed down from one generation to the next. But it only continues if no one is willing to stop it. I decided that the cycle would end with me. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel for more stories about family, hurt, and the ways people rise up to reclaim their voice. Maybe in one of the next stories, you will find a piece of yourself too.